On January 31st, 1943, Paulus surrendered along with the main group of German forces fighting in Stalingrad. Pictures of the first interrogations of Marshal Paulus shortly after his capture at Stalingrad are well known and famous. But few people know what was actually said during these meetings. When he met his victors later this day at the Soviet Don Front HQ, the interrogation was kept secret. Yet one cameraman was exceptionally allowed as a close friend of General Rokossovsky. He took a few photos of the meeting, but he also wrote down what was being said. This is their first translation into English language. The cameraman became the most famous documentary director in the Soviet Union. His name was Roman Karman.
Roman Karman, The Last Days at Stalingrad and the First Interrogation of a Field Marshal. A video by Stalingrad Battle Data. One of the most influential figures in Soviet war documentary filmmaking, Roman Karman portrayed the Spanish Civil War, the battles on the German-Soviet front in World War II, and conflicts linked with the rise of communism in Asia and South America. Frames from his footage were included in a number of documentaries which became famous both in the USSR and abroad, such as the signing of the final surrender of Germany. But most important for us here, he also captured the very first images of Field Marshal Paulus surrendering at Stalingrad. His picture, taken on the 1st of February 1943 and titled Interrogation of Paulus, in the presence of General Rokossovsky and Marshal Voronov, went right around the world press. Karman had not slept for 3 days, as he had so much work capturing the historical events of the last days of the fighting in Stalingrad and the first interrogation of a field marshal. But he nevertheless flew to Moscow immediately after this filming. It was necessary to deliver at once the pictures of the defeated German troops and senior officers. Karman's unique account of this historical shooting has never previously been translated into English. In a small, hotly heated log hut in the village of Zavargino, a map of Stalingrad with the markings outlined in coloured pencils is spread out on a table. Around the table are standing people whom I met in the midst of fierce fighting on the outskirts of Moscow. A year has passed since then, but it was like yesterday. There was just slightly more silver frost on the temples of Konstantin Rokossovsky. As usual, the seal of extreme fatigue on the face of the Chief of Staff, Mikhail Malinin, and funny sparkles in the eyes of Artillery Commander Vasily Kasakov. These three went through the whole war as a band of brothers. Where is Paulus' headquarters? Controversial information obtained from prisoners leads to a square in the city centre. Further details unknown. Konstantin Konstantinovich, help me record the capture of Paulus, I said in a praying voice, counting on the good relations that had developed between us during the difficult days of the fighting at Moscow. Rokossovsky grinned. Well, we will help, Karman, with only one condition, service for service. All that I can be useful for, I began. But the commander cut me short. First, help us get Paulus. Everyone around laughed. He called me to a map of the city. Apparently, the command post is somewhere here. Go to Chistiakov's army, and if we can clarify anything further, we'll try to inform you. From the village of Zavaragino, where the headquarters of the Don Front was located, I flew to Stalingrad in a U-2 plane. The Volga steppes, fields of the great battle of Stalingrad, spread under its wings. From here above it was possible to spot spaces with recent traces of the fighting. Thousands of ashen craters had not yet been covered with snow. The earth looked like enlarged pictures of lunar craters. In the endless steppes, cut by gentle curving ravines, large dark spots appeared every minute, which from afar seemed like villages, cities or forests, but when the plane came closer, they turned out to be dense clusters of German vehicles abandoned by Paulus's retreating forces. The pilot circled over 2 German airfields that we encountered along the way. Hundreds of aircraft of all types, some burned out, some crashed, and others perfectly operational on the airfields, but not a single soul. The chirping of our U-2 circling at low level was the only sound that violated the ominous silence of a dead airfield, dotted with swastikas and black crosses, the relics of Göring's invincible aviation. During these minutes the summer days of 1941 came to mind, the golden fields of Belarus, hundreds of black crosses in the blue sky, diving, roaring, rushing triumphantly over our heads, sometimes so low that you could see the face of a German ace in the glass cockpit. Drunk with their previous successes, they already saw themselves in Moscow, and now, here is their tragic hangover on the bank of the Volga. The wheels of the plane gently touched the snowfield near the crumbling buildings of the Vodoponova station. Today at dawn the Germans were driven out of here, retreating east to the outskirts of Stalingrad. The battle had already spread to the central areas of the city. The earth shudders from the cannonade of thousands of guns. The pocket is shrinking down with every hour. On this side of the encirclement, the city is filled with crowds of German soldiers who have just surrendered. They are bewildered, asking our fighters, where to go now? The soldiers wave them away. They have only one thought, to move on. And the Germans who surrendered are being assembled into columns, wandering somewhere to assembly points, accompanied by several guards. Their appearance is terrible, wrapped in blankets, handkerchiefs and some rags, hungry, losing not only their military but also their human appearance. A group of Germans is standing near our firing guns. They look with curiosity at the work of Soviet artillerymen, who send shell after shell over there on the enemy. The gunners carry on with their job, ignoring these unusual spectators. The Katyusha rocket launchers also attract crowds of German soldiers. Trembling, they observe each volley like a fiery tornado. In their eyes there's a fear mixed with joy. They are spectators now, and no longer targets. January 29. I journeyed all day long in the streets of Stalingrad. The noise of the fighting is stunning. The troops of Shumilov, Tolbukin, Chistiakov and Chuikov are now engaged in the final stages of clearing the city of groups of machine gunners still entrenched in the destroyed houses. In several places I had to leave the car and make it on foot. The city is clogged with German vehicles. Next to the huge trucks are dozens of abandoned cars. Today hundreds of soldiers and officers continued to surrender. Prisoners are first sent to feeding areas. Near the Volga, the headquarters of the 100th Infantry Division, along with its commander, Lieutenant General Sana, was surrounded and captured by soldiers of the 10th Army. I saw him last night. He is 54 and has been awarded many orders. The medals sparkle on his chest. He said that Paulus and his headquarters were hidden somewhere in the basement of the city centre, changing location every 2 to 3 hours. Paulus, said General Sana, is fulfilling Hitler's directive to fight to the last soldier. The troops were ordered to carefully search for Paulus, to scour the entire city, to inspect each basement. At noon, 4 German planes appeared over the city and randomly dropped supplies. All were unpacked by our soldiers. I got a pack of dry biscuits and a huge piece of fat Ukrainian sausage, obviously intended for Colonel General Paulus. Several other generals surrendered this day. At the headquarters of the division, where I checked in to find out the situation, they were negotiating a truce. A truce envoy was sent by the commander of the famous 376th Infantry Division, General von Daniels. He wished to surrender with the remnants of the division. We climb onto a hill where a deep ravine could be seen, the Zaritsa riverbed. A sinuous black ribbon descends into the ravine from the opposite high bank, a column of German prisoners. As they come closer, we can see the lonely figure of a man walking in front of them, a dog circling around him. Behind went a group of men, followed by a long black ribbon. The man with the dog is a general, a division commander. The group of men his headquarters staff, and the black ribbon his division. The short and puny-looking General von Daniels is watching his feet as he walks, his hands wrapped in a rabbit clutch. He had led his troops with fire and sword through the Ukraine and the Don villages. Now he leads them for the last time in the Second World War, into the frozen channel of the Zaritsa River. The grenadiers of the 376th Division were first defeated last winter near Moscow. They marched on the Russian capital foreseeing the end of the war, yet for them the war ended here in Stalingrad. At the bottom of the ravine we meet them. The general's freckled face is pale and emaciated. His eyes without brows are questioningly fixed on Major Sorokin, the representative of our headquarters. In the general's eyes an expression of pain and shame. He stands alert, barely moving his thin, bloodless lips. I listen. The general, it turns out, is worried about his personal items. He left 2 suitcases in the staff dugout. His eyes express genuine alarm, not for the honour of the defeated division, but for 2 suitcases of some junk. His staff officers lower their large backpacks on the snow. The mighty dog, a German shepherd, walks around the feet of its owner general several times and slowly lays down on the snow near the boots of a Soviet officer. The general was put in a jeep and taken to the army headquarters. May I ask, said the general, addressing the chief of staff, which military unit captured me and my soldiers? During this period, when we were surrounded, our intelligence was almost inactive, and I did not have the opportunity to know my opponent. Oh, certainly, General, the Chief of Staff replied politely. You were captured by the army commanded by General Tabulkin. Then followed a detailed account of the army's achievements during the war until it came to Stalingrad. The general listened silently, dropping his eyes, propping his grey head with his fists. He warmed up a little and even unfastened 2 buttons on his uniform with medals. Von Daniels was eventually invited to General Tolbukin's headquarters. Standing upright, he thanked the Soviet general for the polite, chivalrous attitude of the Soviet officers towards him and his men. He said, I surrendered because I considered further bloodshed pointless. The situation of our troops is hopeless. We underestimated the power of the Red Army and paid for it with a cruel defeat. On January 30, however, the rest of the Sixth Army continued the senseless bloodshed, keeping a foothold in small sections of the city. Soviet aircraft ceased bombing the Germans. This had become dangerous for our own troops. Today, squadrons of aircraft leaving Stalingrad flew as in parade. The last group of 35 bombers passed low over the city centre, lining up in the formation of a 5-pointed star. Pilots thus saluted the heroic city. The planes then went on a western course, and Stalingrad saluted them in turn with volleys of heavy guns that destroyed the last nests of enemy resistance. Where is Paulus hiding? All the generals who surrendered are saying that Paulus will do the same in the coming hours. But he will do this only after he can prove that he fought bravely to the last moment, having ruined the last troops obeying his order. Yesterday I asked General von Dreber whether Paulus would shoot himself. The general smiled and shook his head. "He will not do that," he said. At dawn on February the 1st, Soviet soldiers discovered a resistance hub around the central department store. From this half the Germans fired like hell. The unit commander ordered this area surrounded. Soldiers prepared for the decisive assault. Several tanks were brought to the scene and opened fire. A white flag soon appeared. The Germans surrendered. The order was given to cease fire, and soon a truce envoy stepped out of the department store's basement. He said that General Paulus was here with his headquarters and asked us to send a representative for negotiations on surrender. Paulus was asking for a general or a colonel. Colonel Lucan was assigned to negotiate with Paulus. He went to the basement, where he was met by the Chief of Staff of 6th Army, General Schmidt. There could be no new conditions for surrender other than those indicated in the ultimatum presented earlier. No discussion of these conditions, nor can there be a delay in the surrendering process. "If you have any doubts about the hopelessness of your situation," said Colonel Lucan, "get out of the basement. You are surrounded by a large number of well-equipped troops. Around your headquarters are tanks and artillery. I suggest giving up immediately." A few minutes later Paulus came to the colonel and declared that he was transferring himself and his headquarters to the hands of the Soviet command. Soon after, Paulus stepped out of the basement, escorted by staff officers. The personal luggage of the Field Marshal and his closest officers were loaded onto a lorry. Paulus himself, along with Colonel Adam, his personal adjutant, and the Chief of Staff General Schmidt, went to the army headquarters. There was no cameraman in the department store area, and how could one be there, since there were still many centres of resistance in Stalingrad, even at this time? Unless by some miracle one of the operators filming in Stalingrad could have been in this place. Oh, if only I knew that this miracle was actually there, waiting for me. If only I knew that at the headquarters of the 10th Army there was a message for me from Rokossovsky, faithful to his promise, and notifying me about the capture of Paulus. Instead, unaware of the commander's gift awaiting me, I was filming the streets of Stalingrad. With incredible excitement and enthusiasm, I filmed how our soldiers uprooted the last resisting Germans from the basements, how they went out raising their hands, waving a white towel on a stick or any white rag they had. Fighting at the central station began at dawn on February the 1st. Several wagons blazed along the tracks. Bursts of German machine gun fire came down, sparkling from a high water tower. Our soldiers rolled in a 45mm gun for direct fire. Aiming through the barrel, they began to drive shells methodically into each window of the building. Cameraman Boris Scheer and I shot this fight. We filmed enthusiastic about the opportunity to show in one frame both the gunshots and the explosions of the shells. Suddenly, the incredible happened. Silence fell. Yes, we did not notice how it subsided, and then the frantic thunder of the guns completely ceased. The silence was implausible. We didn't immediately realize. Silence. The thunder of continuous gunfire raging in the air suddenly gave way to the silence of a sunny, frosty winter's day. The quiet crackle of a fire, the creak of a sled runner, and someone's soft voice began to be heard. Was the Battle of Stalingrad over? From somewhere in the distance still came the rumble of artillery fire. In the northern part of the city, where there was a second pocket of encirclement, the battle apparently continued. Sitting on bricks and shell crates, soldiers rolled cigarettes and talked among themselves about things from long ago, about fighting, assaults, about a fallen friend, about upcoming battles. They spoke almost without looking at the dense crowd of German soldiers wandering past the ruins. The thought flashed through my mind like lightning. If the Battle of Stalingrad is over, what about Paulus? Surely he surrendered. and perhaps one of the operators is already shooting this historic event. Quick, to 10th Army headquarters. There I eventually got the telephone message from Rokossovsky to go at once to the headquarters of General Shumilov's 64th Army. To my question about what was happening, the duty officer gritted his teeth. It seems that Paulus is surrendering there. These days in Stalingrad, all military units dreamed of capturing Paulus. Therefore the colonel who handed over the telephone message to us was so upset. His army had been outrun. In a minute we were already racing through the ruined city, guided by the map. On the way we ran into a convoy of cars, with a huge steel-coloured one leading. Having guessed that Paulus was in this car, we overtook the convoy and drove to 64th Army headquarters. Near the house there was already a group of officers waiting for the captives. When the convoy of cars appeared, our cameras were standing ready. A tall, thin man got out of the car in a long German overcoat and a crumpled cap. With a tired, confused look, he looked around. The bright sun was shining. He squinted, shifting from foot to foot. Then, slowly treading the large felt boots in the crisp snow, the man went to the porch, climbed the steps, carefully watched by the guard, and then, along with several Soviet officers, he entered the house. This was the commander of 6th German Army, Friedrich Paulus. I excitedly filmed him walking. He looked completely exhausted. The shots that followed were taken in the spacious room of the army headquarters. Slowly undressing in the hallway, Paulus, together with Schmidt and Adam, entered the room. Fortunately for our cameras, the room was flooded with sunlight, and it was possible to shoot. On the threshold, Paulus stood upright, hit his heels and raised his hand in the Nazi salute. Squinting from the sun that hit him in the face, he stepped into the middle of the room, followed by his companions. At the table was 64th Army Commander General Shumilov. Along the walls of the room on the benches were staff officers. With a nod of his head, answering the greeting, Shumilov gestured to Paulus to sit down in a chair. Marking every word, Shumilov said, "Colonel General, you are captured by the 64th Army, which fought with you from the Don to Stalingrad. The command of the army guarantees you military honour and uniform." Paulus listened carefully to the translator and bowed his head. Shumilov continued, "Can you show us a document certifying that you are the commander of the 6th German Army, Colonel General Paulus?" Then Paulus unfastened the buttons of his uniform to take out his soldier's book from his inner pocket, his hands trembling noticeably. There was intense silence in the room. Shumilov carefully read the document, laid it in front of him on the table, and turned his eye back to his captive. "Let me make an important statement," said Paulus. "Please," said Shumilov. "Tonight, General, I received a radio message from my Führer stating that I have been promoted to the rank of Field Marshal." With the nod of his head, Shumilov made it clear that he was accepting the statement. He handed Paulus a pack of Zazbek cigarettes, saying, "Please, Field Marshal." The room was quiet. Paulus's face was tense. The leader of the German army, who put down his Field Marshal's baton at the feet of the victorious Red Army, sat depressed. It was as if he was just now beginning to fully realize the tragedy that befell his troops and himself. The first Field Marshal who surrendered in the history of warfare. The silence was broken only by the light crack of my camera, which recorded this historical episode. His uniform is worn and crumpled. His face is earthy in colour. He seems calm, but his hands tremble as he brings a cigarette to his mouth. Answering questions, he speaks in a quiet, muffled voice, thinking through every word. "Why didn't you accept the ultimatum of the Soviet High Command to surrender?" Shumilov asks him. "I had an order to fight." "Did you have additional instructions after you were surrounded?" "From the very beginning I had instructions to fight to the last opportunity." "Have you ordered the northern group to lay down their arms?" "I am in captivity and do not have the right to give an order to surrender." But when the commander sees that his people are perishing in vain and that further resistance is hopeless, shouldn't he prevent unnecessary bloodshed? It can be decided by the one who is with the troops. I am in captivity. In the course of further conversation, Paulus said, "This is my first time in Russia. In World War I, I fought on the Western Front. I see now that it is difficult to defeat your country. I could not have foreseen my defeat. I did not expect that you have such forces. In military operations there is fortune and there is misfortune. I suffered misfortune, which, alas, I could not prevent. You captured me. I am your captive." A few hours later, Paulus was sent to Zavaragino, the front headquarters. He was taken there in his own car. In the next car sat General Schmidt and Colonel Adam. The Willys, in which I was travelling, was the third in the convoy. It was a 30-kilometre journey along the Volga steppes. The temperature was about -30 degrees. There were whirlwinds of snow. From time to time we overtook columns of many thousands of prisoners, stretching for kilometres. In narrow places they had to make way for us to pass. The noise of thousands of feet walking on the frosty snow, like the hum of a giant waterfall, stood over the Volga steppes. In the bright beam of headlights, as on a screen, floated sad images of soldiers wrapped in blankets and rags. I involuntarily looked at them through the eyes of the captured Field Marshal, who was witnessing on this frosty night the last tragic parade of his defeated troops. Late at night, the convoy arrived in Zavaragino. I knocked on the door of the log house of the representative of the General Headquarters, Chief Marshal of Artillery, Voronov. I became friends with Nikolai Nikolaevich Voronov in Spain, where he bore the code name Voltaire. He was an advisor to the Republican Army on artillery. We spent many days and nights in besieged Madrid. We met again at Yaram, in Guadalajara, in Brunet. Here, in Zavaragino, we meet for the first time since Spain. "Well, you have a hell of a look," said Marshal Voronov, laughing. "Rokossovsky told me that you filmed Paulus already. Are you hungry?" I confessed that I had forgotten when I ate or slept last. Then he glanced at his watch and said, "Hurry, in 40 minutes we will have the first meeting with the captured Field Marshal. Now Rokossovsky, Malinin and Telegin will come here. Will you allow me, Nikolai Nikolaevich, to be present at the meeting? Just sit here in the corner, but you probably won't be able to shoot. We cannot offer anything for your camera other than a car light bulb. Then I'll take a picture. It is impossible not to fix this historical meeting." General Rokossovsky entered. "Are you already here?" he said, turning to me. "Well, did you film Paulus? What does he look like? Tell me." The front commander called Moscow. At 2 hours and 15 minutes on February the 1st, Field Marshal Paulus was brought into the room. The translator, Major Dyatlenko, told him, "This is the representative of the Supreme High Command, Marshal of Artillery Voronov, and the commander of the Don Front, Colonel General Rokossovsky." The German Field Marshal, standing upright, silently bowed his head. He was invited to sit down. Looking closely at the present Soviet military leaders, he asked, "Was it you who signed the document forwarded to me by the truce, the ultimatum to surrender?" "Yes, it was us," said Rokossovsky. "Field Marshal, we invite you at such a late hour," said Voronov, "to solve an important issue. Your troops are defeated. Thousands of your soldiers surrendered, and you, Field Marshal, are captured. But in the northern part of the city, in a narrow pocket, the last group of your troops continue to resist. The Soviet command has large-scale firepower artillery, aircraft, sufficient to destroy this group within a few hours. We suggest that you, Field Marshal, turn to your soldiers and officers with a proposal to lay down their arms. This will prevent useless bloodshed. The life of your soldiers is in your hands, Field Marshal. Paulus listened to Voronov carefully. His face twitched nervously. Rokossovsky handed him a pack of cigarettes. Paulus took one. His hand trembled. He replied, "I cannot give such an order to my troops." "Why?" "Because I'm in captivity and they are fighting. I simply do not have the right to order them to surrender." "But you are aware of the senselessness of their resistance," exclaimed Rokossovsky. "They will be destroyed." Paulus turned to Rokossovsky. There was expressed pain in his eyes. He understood the humanity of the proposal made by the Soviet generals, and, of course, felt the measure of his responsibility over his soldiers.